The knife was at her throat before she even heard him move. Lyra froze, her hands still wet with dishwater, the cold steel pressing just hard enough to make her breath catch. Behind her, a low voice, rough with suspicion, asked her a single question. "Who are you really?" She had trained herself for this moment for 3 years. Ever since she fled the burning halls of her homeland, she had rehearsed 100 lies, 100 calm answers, 100 ways to make her heartbeat sound ordinary. But nothing could have prepared her for the way her whole body went still when she realized the voice belonged to the pack's second in command, a wolf named Garen, who had never once looked twice at her before tonight. Someone had talked. Someone had noticed something. She swallowed and kept her eyes down, the way a proper servant should. "I am no one important," she said quietly. "Just a girl who cleans the floors and washes the dishes. Please, I have done nothing wrong." Garen studied her for a long moment, his nose flaring slightly as if trying to catch a scent that did not belong. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he lowered the blade and stepped back, muttering something about the guards being on edge because of rumors from the north. He warned her to stay out of the shadows at night, and then he was gone, his boots echoing down the stone corridor. Lyra did not move for a long time. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear alone. It was fury, quiet and old, the kind that had kept her alive this long. She was not just a servant, she was Lyra Ashwood, though that was not her true name, and beneath her plain gray dress and the calluses on her palms, she carried blood that the entire kingdom of Blackthorn believed had been wiped from the earth. She was the last living heir of the Moonfire line. 3 years ago, her family's territory had been overrun in a single, brutal night. She still remembered the smell of smoke curling through the trees, the sound of her mother's voice telling her to run and never look back, never speak her real name again. She had been 16 then. Now she was 19, and she had spent every day since pretending to be nothing at all. The Blackthorn estate was the last place anyone would think to look for a Moonfire heir, which was exactly why she had chosen it. It was ruled by Alpha King Kaelin Ashgrave, a wolf whose reputation for strength and unyielding control stretched across every territory in the region. If the daughter of his family's oldest rivals were hiding anywhere near him, logic said it would be the last place on earth she would choose to hide. That was the whole point. She rose before dawn each morning, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, hauled water from the well, and kept her head low whenever any wolf of rank passed by. She had learned to mute the part of herself that wanted to stand taller, to meet eyes directly, to speak without lowering her voice. Royal blood carried instincts, and those instincts screamed at her constantly to stop cowering. She ignored them every single day. But tonight had shaken something loose. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the narrow window of the servants' quarters, looking out over the moonlit courtyard. Even from here she could feel it, the low hum of power that seemed to radiate from the main hall where the Alpha King held his nightly meetings. She had felt that hum every night since arriving, and every night it seemed to grow slightly stronger, as if it were somehow reaching for her. She told herself it was only her imagination. Fear did strange things to the mind. The following morning, she was assigned to deliver a tray of tea and bread to the private study on the second floor, a task normally given to a senior servant named Della. When Lyra asked why the change, Della only shrugged and said something about the king wanting fresh faces around him lately, then hurried off before Lyra could ask anything more. Lyra's stomach twisted as she climbed the stairs, tray balanced carefully, her expression schooled into practiced blankness. She had avoided this part of the estate for a reason. The closer she came to Kaelin Ashgrave, the harder it became to keep her true nature buried. The study door was open when she arrived. Kaelin sat behind a heavy wooden desk, papers spread before him, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. He did not look up right away, and for a moment she allowed herself simply to observe him, the way anyone might study a dangerous animal from a careful distance. He was younger than she expected an Alpha King to be, though his presence filled the room the way older, more seasoned leaders often failed to. There was a stillness to him, a controlled power that reminded her uncomfortably of her own father, back before everything had been taken from her. She set the tray down gently on the corner of his desk and turned to leave without a word, exactly as she had practiced 1,000 times in her head. "Wait," he said. Her whole body went rigid. She turned back slowly, keeping her eyes fixed somewhere near his shoulder rather than his face. "Yes, my lord." "You are new here," he said. It was not a question. 2 months, my lord, she answered, keeping her voice flat and unremarkable. "I was hired to help in the kitchens." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt that same strange pull she always felt near him, as though her wolf recognized something in his wolf that her human mind refused to acknowledge. She hated the feeling. She had spent years training herself not to feel anything at all around wolves of power, and yet here it was again, insistent and unwelcome. "You may go," he finally said, his tone unreadable. She nodded and left as quickly as she dared, without appearing to flee. That night, she lay awake on her narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling above her, replaying the moment over and over. There had been something in his eyes, something searching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he could not quite name. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself that fear was twisting ordinary moments into something more dangerous than they truly were. But deep down, in the part of herself she tried hardest to silence, she knew the truth. The Alpha King had noticed her, and a wolf like him did not simply forget the things he noticed. 2 days later, disaster struck without warning. It began as an ordinary afternoon in the kitchens, steam rising from great pots of stew, servants moving quickly between tasks under the watchful eye of the head cook. Lyra had been assigned to carry a basket of firewood toward the great hearth, when a spark leapt from the flames and caught the edge of a dry linen cloth hanging nearby. Within seconds the fire spread, catching a stack of kindling, then licking hungrily toward a shelf lined with oil jars. Panic erupted. Servants screamed and scattered, some running for water, others simply fleeing the growing flames. In the chaos, Lyra spotted a small child, no older than 6, the son of one of the laundry workers, standing frozen near the very shelf about to collapse under the heat. She did not think. She simply moved. Her body crossed the distance faster than any ordinary person could have managed, faster even than most trained warriors. She scooped the child into her arms and threw herself clear just as the shelf came crashing down, oil jars shattering, and flames roaring upward where they had been standing only a heartbeat before. The kitchen erupted into further chaos, as workers rushed to smother the flames with wet cloths and buckets of water. In the confusion, no one seemed to notice the impossible speed with which the new servant girl had moved, no one except a lone figure standing in the shadowed doorway, who had come down to investigate the commotion himself. Kalen Ashgrave watched the entire scene unfold with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight. He had seen countless displays of strength and speed in his long life as a ruling alpha, but what he had just witnessed did not belong to an ordinary servant girl. It belonged to something far older, far rarer, something his instincts recognized even before his mind could process what he was seeing. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, before anyone noticed him there at all. Lyra, breathless and trembling from the surge of power that had rushed through her, set the crying child down gently and pressed a steady hand to the boy's shoulder until his sobs quieted. Around her, servants praised her quick thinking, calling her brave for reacting so fast, never suspecting the truth behind her speed. She accepted their thanks with a shaky smile, her heart hammering with dread rather than relief. She had let herself slip. Just for a moment, but a moment was all it ever took. That evening, as she scrubbed soot from her hands in the washroom, Della found her and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the king had been seen watching the fire from the doorway before quietly disappearing. Lyra's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression calm, thanking Della for the warning, and promising to be more careful in the kitchens going forward. Alone in her small room that night, she pressed her forehead against the cool stone wall and closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to slow. She could not afford another mistake like today. The Moonfire bloodline had been hunted to near extinction because kingdoms like Blackthorn believed that royal wolf blood posed a threat to the balance of power across the region. If anyone discovered what truly ran through her veins, there would be no mercy, no matter how many years she had spent scrubbing floors and lowering her eyes. She thought of her mother's final words to her, spoken in a voice steadier than the situation had any right to allow. "Survive first," her mother had said. "Everything else comes after." She repeated those words to herself now, like a quiet prayer in the darkness. Survive first. Everything else comes after. But sleep would not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowed doorway of the kitchen, and standing within it, the unmistakable silhouette of the Alpha King, watching her with an expression she could not read, and could not stop thinking about. Somewhere deep within the castle, in his private study, Calen Ashgrave sat awake as well, staring at nothing, his mind circling back again and again to the impossible speed of a servant girl who was supposed to be nothing more than ordinary. He did not yet know what she was, but he intended to find out. Calen Ashgrave did not sleep that night, and when morning came, he summoned his beta, a steady and observant wolf named Rowan, into his study before the sun had fully cleared the hills. "Tell me everything you know about the new kitchen girl," he said, without preamble. Rowan blinked, caught off guard by the request. "The one who pulled the boy from the fire," he asked. "My lord, half the estate is already calling her a hero." "I am not interested in what the estate is calling her," Calen said. "I want to know where she came from, who recommended her, and why no one seems to remember hiring her." Rowan studied his king carefully before nodding and excusing himself to gather what information he could. Calen remained at his desk long after the door closed, staring at nothing, replaying the moment in the kitchen over and over in his mind. The speed she had shown was not something learned through practice. It was something born into blood, the kind of strength only a handful of bloodlines in the entire region still carried, and most of those bloodlines had been extinguished decades ago in the long wars between rival packs. He had grown up hearing stories about the Moonfire line, whispered warnings from his own father about a family whose wolves could move faster than the eye could follow, whose royal blood carried a fire that burned brighter than any ordinary pack members. His father had called them dangerous. Calen had always assumed they were gone, wiped out in the purge that had reshaped the region's borders when he was still a boy learning to walk on 4 legs. If one of them still lived, and if she were hiding here, inside his own walls, the implications stretched far beyond his understanding. It could mean alliances shifting overnight. It could mean war, reignited from ashes, everyone believed had long gone cold. It could mean, and this thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, that his own wolf had recognized something in her that his human mind refused to accept. He shook his head, forcing the thought away, and turned his attention back to the reports on his desk, though his focus kept drifting toward the kitchens below. Meanwhile, Lyra spent the morning trying to convince herself that yesterday's slip had gone unnoticed by anyone who mattered. She threw herself into her chores with even greater focus than usual, scrubbing pots until her arms ached, hauling water without complaint, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the ground whenever any wolf of rank crossed her path. Della found her near the well shortly after midday, her expression tight with concern. "There is talk among the guards," she said quietly, glancing around before continuing. "They say the king has been asking questions about you, where you came from, who brought you here." Lyra's stomach dropped, though she kept her face calm through sheer force of will. "That seems like a strange thing for a king to concern himself with," she said, forcing lightness into her tone. "I only clean floors." Della did not look convinced, but she let the matter drop, patting Lyra's shoulder once, before hurrying off to her own duties. Lyra remained by the well a moment longer, staring down into the dark water, watching her own reflection ripple and distort. She had known this life could not last forever. Hiding in plain sight required a delicate balance, one wrong move away from disaster at every turn. But she had hoped for more time. She had hoped to find a way out of Blackthorn territory, before anyone grew suspicious enough to look closely. That evening, as the sun began sinking behind the western hills, Lyra was summoned unexpectedly to the main hall. Her heart hammered as she made her way there, certain that Garen's suspicion from 2 nights ago had finally been reported to someone higher, someone who would demand answers she could not safely give. But when she arrived, it was not Garen waiting for her. It was Calen himself, standing near the great hearth, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You asked for me, my lord," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I did," he said. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did in the kitchens. The boy you saved belongs to one of my most loyal servants. His mother has not stopped weeping with gratitude since it happened." Lyra kept her eyes lowered, unsure how to respond to praise she had not expected. "It was instinct, my lord," she said carefully. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone could have moved that fast," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they should have been for such a simple sentence. Lyra felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing through possible responses, all of them feeling equally dangerous. I have always been quick on my feet, she said finally, forcing a small, humble smile. My mother used to say I was born running. Kaelin studied her for a long moment, and she felt that same strange pull again. The sensation of being seen too closely, understood in ways she had not intended to reveal. Then, unexpectedly, he simply nodded and gestured toward the door. You may return to your duties, he said. Again, thank you. She curtsied quickly and left before he could ask anything further, her heart still racing as she hurried back toward the servants' quarters. She did not know whether she had passed his test or merely postponed it, but either way, she understood clearly now that the Alpha King's attention had firmly settled upon her, and attention from a wolf like him rarely faded without consequence. Over the following days, small things began to shift. Lyra noticed guards positioned more frequently near the kitchens, their eyes lingering on her a moment longer than necessary before moving on. She noticed Della growing quieter around her, as though carrying knowledge she did not know how to share safely. She noticed, most unsettling of all, that Kaelin himself seemed to find increasingly frequent reasons to walk through parts of the estate where she happened to be working. It became impossible to ignore that she was being watched, carefully and deliberately, by the very wolf whose family had once helped drive her own bloodline to the edge of extinction. She began sleeping with one eye open, keeping a small bundle of essentials hidden beneath her cot, in case she needed to flee at a moment's notice. She rehearsed escape routes through the kitchens and servants' corridors during her rare moments of rest, memorizing which doors led outside, which paths avoided the guard patrols, which direction led fastest toward the forest beyond the estate walls. Yet despite every rational instinct urging her to run now, before it became too late, something kept her rooted in place. Perhaps it was exhaustion from years of constant fleeing. Perhaps it was the strange, unwelcome pull she felt whenever Kaelin's presence drew near, a sensation her wolf recognized even as her human mind rejected it entirely. Or perhaps, deep down, she was simply tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be smaller than she truly was. Whatever the reason, she stayed, even as the walls around her secret grew thinner with each passing day. One evening, nearly a week after the fire, Lyra was tasked with delivering fresh linens to the private chambers on the upper floor, a task that required passing directly beside the Alpha King's own quarters. She moved quickly and quietly, keeping her footsteps light, hoping to complete the task without encountering him at all. But as she rounded the final corner, she nearly collided directly into his broad chest, the stack of linens tumbling from her arms in surprise. "Forgive me, my lord," she gasped, dropping quickly to gather the fallen linens before he could see the flush rising in her cheeks. He knelt as well, helping her gather the scattered fabric, his hands brushing against hers for the briefest moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, something warm and electric that she had not felt in years, not since before her family's world had burned to ash around her. She pulled back sharply, standing quickly, and clutching the linens tightly against her chest. "Thank you, my lord," she said, her voice unsteady. "I should return to my duties." Kaelin rose as well, studying her with an expression that mixed curiosity with something else, something softer and far more dangerous than mere suspicion. "Of course," he said quietly. "Be careful on the stairs." She nodded and hurried away, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of exposure, and everything to do with the warmth still lingering where his hand had touched hers. That night, lying awake once more, she forced herself to confront an uncomfortable truth. The danger she faced was no longer only about hiding her bloodline from a kingdom that wished her line eradicated. It had become something far more complicated, something involving a growing, unwelcome awareness between herself and the very king whose family history was tangled with her own family's destruction. She reminded herself firmly that whatever strange pull existed between them changed nothing about the danger she faced. If Kaelin Ashgrave discovered the truth of her royal wolf blood, sentiment would matter little against centuries of inherited fear and rivalry. Kings did not marry ghosts of old enemies. Kings destroyed them. Yet even as she told herself this, she could not fully silence the small, traitorous part of her heart that wondered what might happen if, just this once, the old rules of blood and rivalry did not hold true. Outside her window, the moon rose high and full, casting silver light across the quiet courtyard, and somewhere within the castle walls, Kaelin Ashgrave stood at his own window, staring out at that same moon, wrestling with instincts he did not yet understand, and a growing certainty that the servant girl in his kitchens was far more than she appeared to be. 3 spies had entered Blackthorn territory disguised as traveling merchants, and none of them knew that their presence had already been noticed by the sharp eyes of the estate's night guards. Lyra learned of the strangers by accident, overhearing 2 guards discussing the matter in hushed voices near the stables while she delivered feed to the horses. She kept her expression neutral, continuing her task without pause, though her mind raced through the implications immediately. Strangers asking questions about bloodlines and old rivalries could mean only one thing to a girl in her position. Someone, somewhere, suspected the truth, and word had begun spreading beyond these walls. She finished her chores as quickly as she could, and hurried to find a quiet corner where she could think without interruption. Her hiding place at Blackthorn had always relied on anonymity, on being forgettable, unremarkable, invisible among dozens of other servants. If spies were now moving through the region, asking pointed questions, her carefully constructed disguise might not hold much longer. That evening, tension in the estate grew palpable. Extra guards were posted along the outer walls, and whispers spread quickly among the staff about strangers being questioned and turned away at the gates. Lyra kept herself busy in the kitchens, grateful for the noise and chaos that helped mask her racing thoughts, though she noticed Kalen himself moving through the halls with unusual urgency, speaking in low, clipped tones with his guards and advisors. Near midnight, unable to sleep, she slipped quietly from her narrow cot and made her way toward the kitchen gardens, hoping the cool night air might calm her restless mind. She had barely stepped outside when she sensed movement in the shadows near the garden wall, a presence too quiet and too deliberate to belong to an ordinary guard. She froze, every instinct screaming danger, and reached instinctively for the small dagger she kept hidden beneath her apron for emergencies such as this. A figure emerged from the darkness, cloaked and hooded, moving with the careful precision of someone trained for stealth rather than ordinary travel. "Who are you?" she demanded quietly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. The figure paused, studying her for a long moment before speaking in a low voice that carried an unmistakable accent from the Northern Territories, the very region her family's line had once ruled before its destruction. "I mean you no harm," the stranger said carefully. "I am only searching for information regarding old bloodlines rumored to have survived the purge many years ago." Lyra's blood ran cold, though she forced her expression to remain neutral. "I know nothing of such matters," she said. "I am only a servant here." The stranger studied her closely, and for one horrifying moment, she feared her disguise had finally failed her completely. But then, to her surprise, the figure simply nodded and stepped back into the shadows, muttering an apology for disturbing her, before disappearing entirely into the darkness beyond the garden wall. She remained frozen for several minutes afterward, her heart hammering, before finally forcing herself back inside, locking the door behind her with trembling hands. Whoever that stranger had been, their search for survivors of her bloodline meant the danger surrounding her had grown far more immediate than she had previously understood. The following morning, the estate buzzed with news that guards had captured 2 suspicious individuals attempting to breach the outer perimeter during the night. Lyra listened carefully to the whispered gossip among the other servants, learning that the intruders had been brought before Kalen himself for questioning, their true purpose still unclear to most of the staff. She wanted desperately to know what those intruders had revealed, whether her own name or description had come up during their interrogation, but she dared not ask too many questions herself, lest her curiosity draw unwanted attention. Later that day, she was summoned once again to the main hall, her stomach twisting with dread as she made her way there, certain this time that her secret had finally been exposed. But when she arrived, she found Kalen alone, his expression grave and thoughtful, rather than accusatory. "I have reason to believe there are individuals in this region searching for someone with a very particular and very rare heritage," he said without preamble, watching her carefully as he spoke. "Someone connected to a bloodline believed extinguished many years ago." Lyra kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse raced beneath her calm exterior. "That sounds like a serious matter, my lord," she said carefully. "I hope your guards are able to protect the estate from such threats." Kalen studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense that she feared he could see straight through the careful mask she had constructed over years of practice. "I intend to protect everyone within these walls," he said finally, his voice softening slightly, "including you." The words caught her off guard, and for a moment she simply stared at him, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected declaration. "Why would you concern yourself with my safety specifically, my lord?" she asked carefully, genuinely curious despite the danger of the question. Kalen hesitated, something flickering across his expression that looked almost like uncertainty, an emotion she had not expected to see from a wolf of his rank and reputation. "Because I do not believe you are simply an ordinary servant," he said quietly. "And because whatever you are hiding, I intend to discover the truth eventually." Lyra's heart pounded violently against her ribs, though she forced herself to maintain composure. "I am exactly what I appear to be, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the lie. "Nothing more." He studied her a moment longer before nodding slowly, though his expression made clear he remained unconvinced. "You may return to your duties," he said finally, "but be careful. Whoever these strangers are searching for, I suspect they will not stop until they find what they seek." She curtsied quickly and left the hall, her mind racing as she hurried back toward the safety of the kitchens. The walls closing in around her secret felt tighter now than ever before, and she understood with growing certainty that time was running out for her carefully constructed disguise. That night, she began seriously considering whether it was finally time to flee Blackthorn entirely, to disappear once more into unfamiliar territory, before the truth of her identity could be discovered by those hunting her bloodline. Yet even as she packed a small bundle of essentials beneath her cot, preparing for a hasty departure, she found herself hesitating, torn between the instinct to run and a growing, unwelcome reluctance to leave behind the strange, complicated connection that had begun forming between herself and the Alpha King. She told herself firmly that sentiment could not outweigh survival, that whatever strange pull she felt toward Kalen Ashgrave meant nothing against the very real danger of discovery. Yet as she lay awake that night, staring at the darkened ceiling above her, she could not shake the memory of his voice, quiet and sincere, promising to protect her, even without knowing the full truth of what she truly was. Perhaps, she thought reluctantly, leaving would not be as simple as she had once believed. Outside, the moon continued its slow arc across the sky, indifferent to the quiet turmoil building within the walls of Blackthorn Estate, while somewhere beyond the borders, more strangers continued their patient search for a bloodline the world believed long extinguished. The captured intruders were kept in the lower cells beneath the estate, and rumors of their interrogation spread through the servant quarters, faster than fire through dry grass. Lyra listened carefully whenever the topic arose, careful never to ask direct questions herself, gathering fragments of information from the careless chatter of guards and kitchen staff alike. She learned that the two intruders had confessed, under pressure, to searching for evidence of a surviving Moonfire heir, rumored to be hiding somewhere within the Northern Territories. She learned that they had been sent by a faction unrelated to Blackthorn itself, a group of opportunists hoping to use such a bloodline as leverage in ongoing territorial disputes between rival packs. The knowledge did little to ease her fear. If word of a surviving heir had spread far enough to reach opportunistic spies from distant factions, then her secret was no longer contained within the walls of a single estate. It had become a rumor traveling across territories, gaining momentum with each retelling, drawing dangerous attention from every direction at once. She redoubled her efforts to remain unremarkable, avoiding unnecessary conversations, keeping her head down during every task, refusing every opportunity that might draw additional attention her way. Yet despite her best efforts, she noticed Kalen's gaze finding hers more frequently across crowded rooms, his expression thoughtful and searching, in ways that made her chest tighten, with a complicated mixture of fear and something far more difficult to name. One afternoon, while delivering supplies to the estate's small library, she overheard two advisors discussing the captured intruders in hushed, urgent tones. Their words carried far enough down the empty corridor that she paused instinctively, straining to listen without appearing obvious. "The girl they seek carries eyes like molten gold," one advisor murmured, "a mark unique to the Moonfire line alone, passed down through royal blood for generations." Lyra's breath caught sharply in her throat. She had always known her eyes carried an unusual color, a deep amber that occasionally seemed to catch fire in bright sunlight, but she had assumed such a trait unremarkable, easily dismissed as simple genetic variation, rather than an unmistakable mark of royal heritage. She hurried away before the advisors noticed her presence, her mind racing through every interaction she had ever had with anyone at Blackthorn. desperately trying to recall whether her eyes had ever betrayed her in a moment of carelessness. She thought immediately of Kalen, of the many times his gaze had lingered on her face, studying her far more intently than any ordinary servant deserved. Panic began building steadily within her chest, a slow and creeping dread that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. She began wearing a scarf, loosely draped to shadow her face whenever possible, keeping her eyes lowered even more diligently than before, terrified that a single, unguarded glance might finally reveal the truth she had fought so desperately to conceal. That evening, Kalen summoned her once again to his private study, and despite every instinct urging caution, she could not refuse a direct order from the estate's ruling alpha, without arousing far greater suspicion than simple compliance would create. She entered the study with her eyes deliberately lowered, her posture carefully composed, despite the frantic pounding of her heart. Kalen sat behind his desk, watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between curiosity and quiet determination. "I have been thinking about our previous conversations," he said slowly, watching her carefully, "and I find myself increasingly certain that you are not simply an ordinary servant girl." Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her voice carefully steady despite the panic building within her. "I do not know what you mean, my lord," she said quietly. "Look at me," he said, his voice gentle but unmistakably firm. She hesitated, every instinct screaming against the request, knowing full well what might happen the moment her eyes met his directly. But refusing a direct command from the Alpha King would only deepen his suspicion further, and so, with great reluctance, she slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them spoke. She watched his expression shift subtly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the unusual amber color of her irises, a shade she had always known set her apart from ordinary wolves, but had never fully understood the danger such a simple trait might represent. "Your eyes," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something that sounded almost like wonder, mixed with growing certainty. "I have seen that color only once before, in an old portrait long buried within my family's private archives." Lyra's heart pounded violently, her mind racing desperately for some plausible explanation, though none came readily to mind. "It is simply an unusual trait passed down through my family," she said carefully, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the terror building within her chest. "Nothing more significant than that." Kalen studied her a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before finally nodding slowly, though she could see clearly that her explanation had done little to ease his growing suspicion. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "or perhaps there is far more to your story than you are currently willing to share." She said nothing further, uncertain how to respond without revealing more than she intended, and after a long, tense silence, Kalen finally dismissed her, allowing her to return to her duties with her secret still intact, though clearly hanging by an increasingly fragile thread. That night, lying awake once more, Lyra made a difficult decision. She could no longer afford to remain at Blackthorn, waiting passively for her identity to be discovered through careless mistakes or unlucky coincidence. She would need to leave, quietly and quickly, before Kalen's growing suspicions solidified into certain knowledge. She began preparing in earnest, gathering what few possessions she could carry discreetly, memorizing the safest routes through the servants' corridors toward the outer walls. She planned to slip away during the deep hours of early morning, when the guards' attention would be at its weakest, disappearing into the forest beyond the estate before anyone noticed her absence. Yet even as she prepared for her departure, she found herself troubled by an unexpected reluctance, a quiet ache in her chest at the thought of leaving behind the strange, complicated connection that had begun forming between herself and the Alpha King. She told herself firmly that such sentiment was foolish, linked dangerous, and utterly beside the point. Survival demanded sacrifice, and sentiment had no place in decisions that determined whether she lived or died. Still, as she lay awake staring at the darkened ceiling above her, she could not fully silence the small, persistent voice within her heart that whispered quietly of regret, of paths not taken, of a future she might have had if circumstances had been different, if the blood in her veins carried less danger and more possibility. She closed her eyes finally, forcing herself toward sleep, determined to follow through with her plan, regardless of the reluctance clouding her heart. Tomorrow, before dawn broke fully across the horizon, she would disappear once more into the unknown, leaving behind Blackthorn, its complicated Alpha King, and the dangerous secret she had fought so desperately to protect. But fate, it seemed, had other plans entirely in store for her. She woke before dawn, her small bundle of belongings already hidden beneath her cloak, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination as she slipped quietly from the servants' quarters into the darkened corridor beyond. The estate lay silent around her, most of its residents still deep in sleep, the only sounds the distant crackle of dying torches and the soft whisper of wind moving through the outer courtyard. She moved carefully, keeping to the shadows, following the escape route she had memorized so thoroughly over the past several days. She had nearly reached the servants' side entrance when a familiar voice called out softly from the darkness behind her, freezing her mid-step. "Leaving so soon?" Kaelin asked quietly, stepping from the shadows near the corridor's end. Lyra's heart dropped violently, though she forced herself to remain composed, despite the sudden surge of panic flooding through her. "I could not sleep, my lord," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady. "I only wished for some fresh air." Kaelin studied her for a long moment, his gaze drifting deliberately toward the small bundle barely concealed beneath her cloak. "That seems like quite a lot of fresh air you intend to gather," he said quietly, his tone carrying no accusation, only quiet observation. She said nothing, uncertain how to respond, her mind racing desperately for some plausible explanation that might ease his suspicion. But before she could speak, Kaelin continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "I am not going to stop you from leaving if that is truly what you wish," he said, "but I would ask you to consider staying, at least long enough to hear what I have to say." Lyra hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee immediately and a quiet curiosity about what he intended to share. Finally, against her better judgment, she nodded slowly, allowing him to lead her toward a quiet alcove near the courtyard, away from prying eyes and listening ears. "I have suspected for some time now that you are not simply an ordinary servant," he began carefully, watching her closely as he spoke. "Your speed during the fire, your unusual eyes, the strangers searching this region for someone matching your exact description. I believe you carry Moonfire blood." Lyra's breath caught sharply, her entire body tensing as the truth finally hung openly between them for the first time. She considered denying it once more, offering another careful lie, but something in his expression, steady and sincere, rather than accusatory, made her hesitate. "If that were true," she said slowly, choosing her words with extreme care, "what would you intend to do with such knowledge?" Kaelin studied her for a long moment before answering. "My family's history with the Moonfire line is complicated," he said quietly. "My father believed your bloodline dangerous, a threat to be eliminated rather than understood, but I do not share all of my father's beliefs." "What do you believe?" she asked carefully, her heart pounding as she waited for his answer. "I believe," he said slowly, "that whoever you truly are, you have shown nothing but courage and kindness since arriving at this estate. I believe you saved a child's life without hesitation, expecting nothing in return. And I believe that whatever danger your bloodline might represent to others, it poses none to me." Lyra felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to reveal such vulnerability even now. "You cannot know that for certain," she said quietly. "Bloodlines carry history, and history carries consequences neither of us can fully control." "Perhaps," Kaelin admitted, "but I would rather understand the truth fully than continue living with uncertainty and suspicion. If you are willing, I would like to know your real story." Lyra hesitated for a long moment, weighing the risks of trust against the exhaustion of continued deception. Finally, with a deep breath, she began speaking, slowly at first, then with growing steadiness, sharing fragments of her past that she had kept hidden for 3 long years. She told him of her family's territory in the northern hills, of the night everything had burned, of her mother's final desperate instructions to run and never look back. She told him of the years spent moving from place to place, never settling long enough to grow attached, never trusting anyone enough to reveal her true identity. Kaelin listened silently throughout her account, his expression shifting through concern, sympathy, and something that looked remarkably like quiet anger on her behalf. When she finally finished speaking, he remained silent for a long moment, processing everything she had shared. "I am sorry for what happened to your family," he said finally, his voice heavy with sincerity. And I am sorry that my own family's history contributed to the fear that has shaped your entire life since that night. Lyra studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda, but found only genuine sympathy reflected in his gaze. You are not what I expected an Alpha King to be, she admitted quietly. Neither are you what I expected a simple kitchen servant to be, he replied, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time since their conversation had begun. Despite the tension of the moment, Lyra found herself smiling slightly in return, a small, genuine expression that felt foreign after years of careful, guarded composure. Perhaps, she said quietly, we are both far more than what we appear to be on the surface. Kalen nodded slowly, his expression growing serious once more. I cannot promise you complete safety, he said carefully. There are those within my own council who would react far less favorably than I have to the truth of your identity, and the strangers searching for you remain a very real danger, regardless of my own personal feelings on the matter. I understand, Lyra said quietly. Which is precisely why I intended to leave before anyone else discovered the truth. Stay, Kalen said suddenly, his voice firm and unexpectedly urgent. Let me help protect you properly, rather than forcing you to face this danger entirely alone. Lyra hesitated, torn between years of ingrained caution and a growing, undeniable desire to finally trust someone with the truth of who she truly was. Finally, against every instinct urging continued flight, she nodded slowly. I will stay, she said quietly, for now. Kalen's expression softened with visible relief, and for a moment, standing together in the quiet darkness of the courtyard alcove, the weight of centuries-old rivalry and inherited fear seemed to fade slightly beneath the simple human connection forming steadily between them. Yet even as she agreed to remain, Lyra understood clearly that the danger surrounding her had not diminished simply because one wolf now knew the truth. If anything, sharing her secret with Kalen Ashgrave had only increased the stakes considerably, binding her fate more closely than ever to the complicated politics and rivalries of Blackthorn's ruling council. Whatever came next, she understood there would be no easy path forward from here. Keeping her secret from an entire estate had been difficult enough. Keeping it while the Alpha King himself now knew the truth proved to be an entirely different challenge altogether. Over the following days, Lyra noticed subtle changes in how Kalen treated her, small gestures of protection disguised carefully as routine decisions. She was reassigned away from tasks that required close contact with visiting dignitaries. Her sleeping quarters were quietly moved closer to the guarded section of the estate, without any official explanation given to the other staff. Extra patrols began appearing near the kitchens and gardens, always positioned casually enough to avoid suspicion, yet clearly intended for her benefit alone. She appreciated his efforts, though she worried constantly that such obvious attention would eventually draw exactly the kind of scrutiny they were both trying desperately to avoid. You are being too careful, she warned him quietly one evening, when their paths crossed briefly near the estate's private gardens. People will begin to notice special treatment given to an ordinary kitchen servant. Kalen's expression remained calm, though she noticed a flicker of concern behind his composed exterior. I would rather face uncomfortable questions than risk your safety, he said simply. She wanted to argue further, to insist that such risks were unnecessary, but something in his steady determination made her hesitate. Instead, she simply nodded, grateful despite her lingering unease, and continued with her daily tasks as normally as possible. Not everyone remained fooled by their careful discretion, however. Garen, the pack's sharp-eyed second-in-command who had first confronted her weeks earlier, with a blade at her throat, began watching her with renewed suspicion, clearly noticing the subtle shifts in her treatment throughout the estate. He said nothing directly to her, but she often caught him observing quietly from a distance, his expression thoughtful and increasingly wary. One afternoon, while delivering supplies to the estate's private council chamber, she overheard raised voices through the partially closed door, unmistakably belonging to Kalen and several senior members of his advisory council. We have received further reports, one advisor's voice carried sharply through the gap in the doorway. Strangers asking questions throughout neighboring territories, all searching for the same individual matching a very specific description. My lord, if such rumors reach the wrong ears, the political consequences could be severe. I am aware of the risks, Kalen's voice replied evenly, though she could hear the underlying tension carefully controlled beneath his measured tone. Another voice, older and clearly frustrated, interjected sharply. If word spreads that you are harboring a Moonfire heir within these very walls, several of our closest allies may reconsider their loyalty entirely. This is not simply a matter of personal sentiment, my lord. This concerns the safety and stability of our entire territory. Lyra froze completely outside the door, her heart pounding violently, as she realized the full extent of political danger her presence now represented, not merely to herself, but to Kaelin's entire rule and reputation among neighboring packs. She backed away quietly, before anyone noticed her presence, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just overheard. She had known, abstractly, that her secret carried political weight beyond simple personal danger, but hearing the concern voiced so directly by Kaelin's own trusted advisors made the reality far more immediate and unsettling. That evening, she sought out Kaelin privately, finding him alone in his study, staring thoughtfully at a map spread across his desk depicting the surrounding territories. "I overheard your counsel earlier," she admitted quietly, watching his reaction carefully. "They fear my presence here threatens your alliances." Kaelin's expression tightened slightly, though he did not seem entirely surprised by her admission. "My counsel worries about many things," he said carefully. "That does not mean their concerns dictate my decisions." "But their concerns are not unfounded," she pressed gently. "If protecting me costs you the loyalty of your allies, the consequences could extend far beyond simply my own safety." Kaelin studied her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly despite the seriousness of their conversation. "Let me worry about my counsel and my allies," he said quietly. "Your only concern should be remaining safe." Lyra shook her head slowly, unwilling to simply accept his reassurance without further discussion. "I cannot allow you to risk your entire rule for my sake," she said firmly. "Perhaps it would be wiser for me to leave after all, before my presence causes irreparable damage to your position." "No," Kaelin said immediately, his voice sharper than she had expected. "I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself simply to ease political tensions among advisors too fearful to see beyond old prejudices." Lyra fell silent, surprised by the intensity of his reaction, though she noticed something else as well, a flicker of genuine fear behind his frustration, an emotion she had not expected to witness from a wolf of his rank and reputation. "Why does my safety matter so deeply to you?" she asked quietly, genuinely curious despite the danger inherent in such a direct question. Kaelin hesitated, clearly wrestling internally with how much honesty to reveal. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but unmistakably sincere. "Because somewhere along the way, without fully intending it, I have come to care for you, far beyond simple political obligation or curiosity." The words hung heavily in the air between them, and Lyra found herself momentarily speechless, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected and vulnerable admission. Part of her wanted desperately to return his sentiment honestly, to admit the complicated feelings that had been steadily building within her own heart since their very first tense encounter weeks earlier. But another part of her, hardened by years of necessary caution, warned strongly against allowing herself such dangerous vulnerability. "I do not know what to say," she admitted finally, her voice quiet and uncertain. "You do not need to say anything right now," Kaelin replied gently. "I only wanted you to understand clearly why I refuse to simply let you leave, regardless of what my council believes is politically wise." Lyra nodded slowly, her heart aching with a complicated mixture of gratitude, fear, and reluctant affection she had not expected to feel again, after everything her family had endured. Whatever came next, she understood clearly that her fate had become inseparably tangled with Kaelin's own, for better or worse, regardless of the political dangers still looming steadily on the horizon. Outside, storm clouds gathered slowly over the distant hills, an ominous warning of turbulent challenges still waiting patiently just beyond the walls of Blackthorn Estate. The storm that had gathered over the distant hills arrived in full force 3 nights later, though the true danger came not from thunder and rain, but from riders who used the chaos of the weather to slip unnoticed toward Blackthorn's outer walls. Lyra woke abruptly to the sound of shouting echoing through the corridors, distant at first, then rapidly growing closer. She scrambled from her cot, pulling her cloak tightly around her shoulders, her heart pounding with instinctive alarm, even before she fully understood the source of the commotion. Della burst into the servants' quarters moments later, her face pale with fear. "Intruders," she gasped, breathless from running. "They have breached the eastern gate. The guards are fighting them back. but there are more than anyone expected. Lyra's mind raced immediately to the strangers who had been searching the region for weeks, the spies whose earlier capture had only delayed, rather than ended their determined pursuit. She grabbed the small dagger she kept hidden beneath her cot, tucking it quickly into her belt, uncertain what role she might need to play in the chaos unfolding around her. She hurried toward the main hall, weaving through panicked servants fleeing in the opposite direction, until she found herself pressed against a stone pillar near the entrance, watching as armed figures clashed violently in the torch-lit courtyard beyond. Blackthorn's guards fought valiantly, but the attackers moved with disciplined precision, clearly trained and organized rather than simple opportunistic raiders. Kalen appeared suddenly at the center of the chaos, his commanding presence rallying his guards even as he engaged directly with several attackers himself. Lyra watched, her heart in her throat, as he moved with lethal efficiency, protecting his people, while simultaneously searching the chaotic courtyard, clearly looking for someone specific among the fleeing servants. She realized, with sudden horrifying clarity, that he was searching for her. Before she could call out to signal her location safely, a rough hand grabbed her roughly from behind, dragging her backward into the shadows beside the pillar. She spun quickly, dagger raised instinctively, only to find herself facing one of the cloaked strangers she had encountered weeks earlier in the garden. "We have finally found you," the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying grim satisfaction rather than surprise. The last heir of the Moonfire line, hiding in plain sight all along. Lyra's blood ran cold, though she forced herself to remain steady, gripping her dagger tightly. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. The stranger smiled coldly. "Your bloodline carries value far beyond simple sentiment," he said. "Certain factions would pay handsomely for proof of your survival, proof that could shift the balance of power across several territories simultaneously." Before Lyra could respond, the stranger lunged forward suddenly, forcing her to react instinctively. Her body moved faster than conscious thought allowed, years of suppressed royal instinct finally breaking free, under the pressure of genuine danger. She twisted away from his grasp, using the momentum to drive her elbow sharply backward, connecting solidly enough to force him stumbling back several steps. The stranger recovered quickly, clearly startled by her unexpected strength, but before he could press his advantage further, a powerful figure crashed into him from the side, driving him hard against the stone pillar. Kalen, his eyes blazing with fierce protective anger, held the stranger firmly pinned, his voice low and dangerous. "Touch her again," he growled, "and you will not survive the encounter." The stranger, recognizing immediately the futility of continued resistance against Blackthorn's Alpha King, went limp, allowing himself to be restrained without further struggle. Kalen signaled sharply toward nearby guards, who quickly secured the intruder, dragging him away toward the estate's holding cells. Kalen turned immediately toward Lyra, his expression shifting rapidly from fierce anger toward urgent concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked quickly, his hands moving gently to check for any sign of injury. "I am fine," she assured him, though her voice trembled slightly from the lingering adrenaline of the encounter. "Thanks to you." Around them, the chaos of battle gradually began settling, as Blackthorn's guards successfully repelled the remaining attackers, capturing several more, while others fled back into the stormy darkness beyond the estate walls. Kalen remained close beside Lyra throughout the following tense hour, refusing to leave her side, even as his advisors approached with urgent reports regarding the captured intruders. Later, once the chaos had fully subsided and the captured attackers had been secured for questioning, Kalen finally allowed himself a moment alone with Lyra, in the quiet safety of his private study. "This attack proves the danger surrounding you has grown far more serious than simple rumor or suspicion," he said grimly, pacing slowly across the room. "Whoever orchestrated tonight's assault clearly possesses significant resources and organization." Lyra nodded slowly, her mind still reeling from the encounter with the stranger in the shadows. "They spoke of factions willing to pay handsomely for proof of my survival," she said quietly. "This is no longer simply about old rivalries or inherited fear. Someone intends to use my existence for direct political advantage." Kalen's expression darkened further at her words. "Then we must move quickly to secure your safety more thoroughly than ever before," he said firmly. "I will not allow you to become a pawn in someone else's political ambitions." Lyra studied him carefully, noticing the fierce determination burning steadily behind his concerned expression. Whatever happens next, she realized clearly, Kaelin intended to protect her regardless of the political cost such protection might ultimately demand from his own rule and reputation. Yet even as gratitude and reluctant affection continued growing steadily within her heart, she understood painfully well that tonight's attack represented only the beginning of far greater dangers still waiting patiently on the horizon, dangers that threatened not only her own safety, but potentially the stability of Kaelin's entire kingdom as well. The interrogation of the captured attackers revealed information far more troubling than either Kaelin or Lyra had anticipated. Under careful questioning, the prisoners confessed that they had been sent by a coalition of ambitious lesser lords from territories bordering Blackthorn, wolves who had long resented the current balance of power maintained through Kaelin's careful alliances. These lords believed that capturing proof of a surviving Moonfire heir would provide them significant leverage, either through claiming her as a valuable hostage, or through publicly exposing Kaelin's decision to harbor her, thereby destabilizing his relationships with more traditional allies, who still viewed the Moonfire bloodline with deep suspicion. Worse still, the prisoners revealed that this coalition had grown impatient with subtlety, planning a second, far larger assault intended to overwhelm Blackthorn's defenses entirely, rather than relying on stealth and infiltration alone. Kaelin called an emergency council meeting immediately upon receiving this information, and for the first time, he insisted that Lyra attend alongside his senior advisors, despite the obvious risk of fully revealing her identity to individuals who had previously known her only as an ordinary kitchen servant. The council chamber fell into stunned silence when Kaelin formally introduced her, explaining calmly and directly that the servant many of them had grown accustomed to seeing throughout the estate was, in fact, the last surviving heir of the Moonfire line. Several advisors reacted with visible alarm, exactly as Lyra had feared they might. One older wolf, clearly agitated, rose sharply from his seat, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "My lord, harboring this individual within our walls has already invited a direct assault upon our home. Continuing to protect her only invites greater danger still." Kaelin remained calm despite the rising tension within the chamber, his voice steady and commanding. "The danger we face stems not from her presence alone, but from ambitious lords seeking any excuse to challenge our stability," he said firmly. "Turning her away now would not eliminate that danger. It would simply hand our enemies exactly the victory they seek, without a single further battle required." Another advisor, younger and visibly more thoughtful than his agitated colleague, spoke up cautiously. "What exactly do you propose we do, my lord?" he asked. "If a larger assault truly is being planned, we cannot simply wait passively for it to arrive." Kaelin nodded, clearly having already considered this question carefully. "We will strengthen our defenses immediately," he said, "and we will reach out discreetly to our most trusted allies, explaining the situation honestly, rather than allowing rumor and fear to distort the truth further. If our alliances are genuine, they will stand with us, despite old prejudices regarding the Moonfire line." The council debated fiercely for the following hour, tempers occasionally flaring, old fears and fresh uncertainties clashing repeatedly throughout the heated discussion. Lyra remained silent throughout most of the debate, watching carefully as Kaelin skillfully navigated the competing concerns of his advisors, refusing repeatedly to abandon his decision to protect her despite mounting pressure from several respected voices within his own council. Eventually, though clearly still uneasy, the council reluctantly agreed to support Kaelin's plan, recognizing that abandoning Lyra now would likely prove more politically damaging than continuing to stand firmly behind their Alpha King's decision. Following the meeting, Lyra found herself alone briefly with Kaelin, in the quiet corridor outside the council chamber, her emotions a complicated tangle of gratitude, guilt, and lingering fear. "You risked a great deal on my behalf in there," she said quietly, studying his tired expression carefully. "I meant every word I said," Kaelin replied simply. "Abandoning you would not eliminate the danger we face. It would only prove that our enemies can manipulate fear into achieving victories they could never earn through honest strength alone." Lyra hesitated, then spoke the fear that had been building steadily within her heart throughout the tense council meeting. "What if your allies refuse to stand with you once they learn the full truth?" she asked quietly. "What if protecting me costs you everything you have built here?" Kaelin turned to face her fully, his expression softening despite the seriousness of their conversation. "Then we will face that outcome together," he said firmly. "I no longer see this as simply your danger alone to bear. Whatever comes next, we will confront it side by side. Lyra felt tears threatening once more at the corners of her eyes, though this time they carried warmth rather than fear. She had spent 3 long years believing herself entirely alone in the world, trusting no one, relying only on her own careful instincts to survive each passing day. Standing now beside Kalen, hearing him speak so firmly of shared responsibility and mutual protection, she felt something long buried within her heart begin cautiously stirring back to life. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with genuine emotion. Kalen reached out gently, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering just slightly longer than necessary. "We still have much work ahead of us," he said softly, "but we will face it together." Outside, preparations began immediately throughout the estate, guards strengthening the outer walls, messengers dispatched swiftly toward neighboring territories to explain the situation honestly to trusted allies, advisors working tirelessly to anticipate every possible strategy their enemies might employ during the coming assault. Lyra, despite her lingering fear, found herself filled with a renewed sense of purpose she had not felt in years. She was no longer simply hiding, waiting passively for danger to find her. For the first time since her family's destruction, she stood prepared to fight actively for her own safety, and for the safety of those who had chosen, against significant risk, to stand firmly by her side. The coming days would test everything Kalen had built during his rule, and everything Lyra had fought so desperately to protect throughout her long years of hiding. But for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she did not face the coming danger entirely alone. The second assault arrived exactly 1 week later, under cover of a moonless night, and this time the attackers came prepared for a far more serious confrontation than their earlier failed infiltration attempt. Blackthorn's guards, forewarned and thoroughly prepared thanks to Kalen's careful strategic planning, met the invading force at the outer walls with disciplined resistance, far stronger than the coalition of lesser lords had anticipated. Torches blazed along the fortifications, illuminating the chaotic battle unfolding, as waves of attackers pressed repeatedly against Blackthorn's determined defenders. Lyra, positioned safely within the estate's fortified inner chambers, as Kalen had insisted, found herself unable to remain passive, while so many fought desperately below. She watched anxiously from a high window, her heart pounding with every clash of steel, and every distant shout carried faintly on the night wind. When word arrived that several guards had fallen wounded near the eastern gate, overwhelmed temporarily by a concentrated push from the attacking coalition, Lyra made a decision that defied every instinct toward careful self-preservation she had cultivated over 3 long years of hiding. She left her chamber swiftly, ignoring the protests of the guards assigned to protect her, moving quickly through the chaotic corridors toward the estate's small infirmary, where wounded defenders were already being carried for treatment. She had learned basic healing skills during her years of wandering, knowledge that had often proven essential for her own survival, and she refused now to stand idle while others suffered when she possessed skills that could genuinely help. She worked quickly and efficiently alongside the estate's healers, tending wounds, stabilizing injuries, offering calm reassurance to frightened injured guards, who had never expected such capable assistance from the quiet kitchen servant they barely recognized in this new context. Word of her actions reached Kalen during a brief lull in the fighting, and despite the ongoing danger, he made his way immediately toward the infirmary, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and lingering fear for her safety. "You should not be here," he said firmly, though his tone carried more concern than genuine anger. "Neither should any of these wounded guards," she replied evenly, continuing her work without pause. "But here we all are." Kalen studied her a moment longer, clearly recognizing the futility of arguing further, before nodding reluctantly and returning to oversee the ongoing defense of the estate's walls. The battle raged for several more hours before Blackthorn's forces finally succeeded in repelling the invading coalition entirely, forcing the remaining attackers into a hasty, disorganized retreat as dawn began breaking slowly across the eastern horizon. Exhausted but victorious, Kalen's guards secured the estate fully, capturing several additional prisoners while confirming that the greater threat had, for now, been successfully neutralized. In the exhausted aftermath of battle, as the first light of morning illuminated the estate's battle-scarred courtyard, Kalen finally found a moment to rest, seeking out Lyra once more within the crowded infirmary, where she continued tending to the wounded despite her own visible exhaustion. "We held them back," he said quietly, relief evident in his tired voice. Lyra nodded, setting aside the bandages she had been using, finally allowing herself a brief moment of stillness. "Thanks to your careful preparation," she said, "and thanks to guards willing to fight so fiercely in defense of this estate." Kalen studied her carefully, his expression softening into something warmer than simple relief. "And thanks to a healer willing to risk her own safety for the sake of others," he added quietly. Lyra felt heat rising in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such direct praise. "I could not simply stand by while others suffered," she said simply. "That," Kalen replied gently, "is precisely the kind of courage that convinces me your bloodline deserves protection, rather than fear." In the days following the failed assault, word spread quickly throughout neighboring territories regarding Blackthorn's decisive victory, and more importantly, regarding the true reason behind the coalition's aggressive actions. Rather than reacting with the fear and suspicion Kalen's advisors had initially worried about, several neighboring allies instead expressed quiet admiration for his willingness to protect an innocent individual against unjust political manipulation. Slowly, cautiously, the political tide began shifting favorably, as more territories recognized the ambitious coalition's true motives as naked opportunism, rather than legitimate concern regarding old bloodline rivalries. Kalen's reputation, rather than suffering as his advisors had initially feared, grew steadily stronger throughout the region, admired now for both his military strength and his willingness to stand firmly by his principles, despite significant political risk. Lyra, watching these developments unfold with cautious hope, allowed herself for the first time in years to imagine a future where she might finally live, openly, without constant fear of discovery and persecution. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with lingering political complications and old prejudices not easily overcome. But for the first time since her family's destruction so many years earlier, she felt genuine hope taking root steadily within her heart. Standing together on the estate's repaired battlements, watching the sun rise fully over the peaceful, victorious countryside, Kalen reached gently for her hand, his fingers intertwining naturally with hers, as though they had always belonged together. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we will face it together, exactly as we have proven ourselves capable of doing throughout these difficult past weeks." Lyra smiled softly, leaning slightly into his steady presence beside her. "Together," she agreed quietly, the word carrying a weight of hope and possibility she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could clearly remember. The battle had been won, but greater challenges and greater possibilities still lay patiently ahead on the horizon. 3 months passed following the failed coalition assault, and Blackthorn Estate settled gradually into a new, more open era, one in which the truth of Lyra's heritage no longer needed to remain hidden behind careful lies and constant vigilance. Kalen had worked tirelessly throughout those months, meeting personally with neighboring rulers, explaining honestly the circumstances surrounding Lyra's survival and the unjust political manipulation that had driven the coalition's aggressive assault against Blackthorn's walls. Slowly, methodically, he rebuilt old alliances on stronger, more honest foundations, while forging new relationships with territories willing to move beyond decades-old fears regarding the Moonfire bloodline. Lyra, no longer forced to hide beneath the guise of an ordinary kitchen servant, found herself gradually stepping into a role she had never imagined possible during her long years of desperate wandering. She began working closely alongside Kalen's council, offering valuable insight regarding the northern territories her family had once ruled, insight that proved unexpectedly useful as Blackthorn expanded its diplomatic reach throughout the region. The remaining members of the ambitious coalition, having lost significant support following their failed assault and subsequent political exposure, found themselves increasingly isolated, their influence steadily diminishing as more territories aligned instead with Blackthorn's demonstrated strength and integrity. Justice, though slow in coming, eventually caught up with the coalition's remaining leaders, who faced consequences appropriate to their reckless ambition and willingness to endanger innocent lives for personal political gain. Amid these significant political developments, something quieter, though equally significant, continued growing steadily between Lyra and Kalen. Their relationship, forged initially through danger and necessary secrecy, deepened gradually into something neither of them had fully anticipated when their paths first collided so tensely within the estate's crowded kitchens months earlier. One evening, as autumn's first cool breeze swept gently across Blackthorn's courtyard, Kaelin found Lyra standing quietly near the garden, where they had first spoken honestly about the truth of her heritage so many months before. "I have been thinking," he said softly, joining her beside the garden wall, "about how far we have both come since that difficult night." Lyra smiled, turning to face him fully, no longer hiding behind lowered eyes and careful, guarded expressions. "It has been quite a journey," she agreed quietly. Kaelin reached gently for her hand, his expression suddenly more serious than his casual tone had suggested moments earlier. "Lyra," he said carefully, "I did not fall for you despite your royal blood, nor because of the danger surrounding your survival. I fell for your courage, your compassion, and your quiet strength throughout everything you have endured." Lyra felt her breath catch, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and lingering disbelief that such happiness could genuinely belong to her after everything her family had suffered years earlier. "I never imagined I would find safety again," she admitted quietly, "let alone happiness. But somehow, standing here with you, I believe both are finally possible." Kaelin smiled warmly, reaching into his cloak to retrieve a small, delicately crafted ring, its design incorporating subtle elements from both their family crests, a symbol of unity between bloodlines, once considered irreconcilable enemies. "Would you consider standing beside me, not merely as someone I protect, but as my equal partner, ruling Blackthorn together, uniting our territories and our people fully and openly?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability clearly evident in his expression. Tears finally slipped freely down Lyra's cheeks, tears no longer born from fear or grief, but from overwhelming joy and hope for a future she had never dared imagine possible during her long years of desperate hiding.
"Yes,"
she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine happiness. "I would be honored to stand beside you, fully and openly, for as long as we both shall live." News of their union spread quickly throughout the region, celebrated widely as a powerful symbol of reconciliation between bloodlines, long divided by fear, suspicion, and old political rivalry. The ceremony itself, held several weeks later within Blackthorn's Grand Hall, drew representatives from territories throughout the region, including several who had once viewed the Moonfire bloodline with deep suspicion, now standing instead as honored guests, celebrating a new era of unity and peace. Lyra stood proudly during the ceremony, no longer hiding behind lowered eyes or carefully guarded expressions, her golden eyes shining brightly and openly, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a proud symbol of her heritage, rather than a dangerous secret, requiring constant concealment. As she exchanged vows with Kaelin before the assembled crowd, she thought briefly of her mother's final words, spoken so long ago amid the chaos and destruction of that terrible night. "Survive first," her mother had said. "Everything else comes after." She had survived, exactly as her mother had instructed. And now, standing proudly beside Kaelin as his equal partner and future queen, she finally understood the deeper truth hidden within her mother's final words. Survival had only ever been the beginning, the necessary foundation upon which something far greater could eventually be built. Together, Lyra and Kaelin ruled Blackthorn wisely and justly in the years that followed, their union serving as a powerful symbol of lasting peace between bloodlines once divided by generations of fear and misunderstanding. The Moonfire line, rather than facing extinction as so many had once believed inevitable, instead found renewed strength and purpose, woven permanently and proudly into the very fabric of Blackthorn's continued prosperity. And though challenges certainly still awaited them in the years ahead, exactly as challenges await every ruler and every kingdom throughout history, Lyra faced her future now with quiet confidence rather than desperate fear, secure finally in the knowledge that she no longer stood alone against the world. She had found not merely safety, but genuine belonging, a home built not on hiding and deception, but on courage, honesty, and love strong enough to overcome even the deepest scars of old rivalry and inherited fear. Her story, once defined entirely by loss and desperate survival, had finally become something far greater, a story of resilience rewarded, of love triumphing over old prejudice, and of a queen finally free to embrace fully the powerful legacy flowing proudly through her royal wolf blood.